I'm Mike Connors, and this is How It Ticks. Welcome back to this special episode with James Blake Wiener. Moving from one historic disaster to another, our next story focuses on the Swiss passengers of the Lusitania, exploring its dramatic and controversial sinking by a German U-boat during World War I. Now, I wanted to use that as a not so subtle segue into another one of your stories, which is still very closely on the same topic, which is the sinking of huge, beautiful boats. This one less well known, but to be honest, I found more fascinating and more interesting given the context, which was the Lusitania.
Yes.
Can you please talk me through the Lusitania? Maybe because everyone knows the Titanic, probably due to the film. Can you explain to me first what the Lusitania was, and then we can go into what led up to its sinking?
Sure. And it's interesting for me to hear you say that you found the Lusitania disaster more compelling, because this is what Swiss readers told me as well. They were more, I received so many emails about the Lusitania and really interesting takes on the Lusitania disaster, and also the poignancy of the various stories of those passengers who had connections to Switzerland who were on board. So it is interesting. You cannot have the Titanic without the Lusitania. The Lusitania is built by the Cunard Line, and it's launched in 1906, and it enters service in 1907. And at that point in time, it is the world's largest, most luxurious ocean liner. And Cunard Line had received some money from the British government to construct the Lusitania and a sister ship, the Mauretania. And this was done so that the Cunard Line could remain independent from JP Morgan's conglomerate of companies, the International Mercantile Marine Corporation, which the White Star Line was a part of, by the way. And the Lusitania was a technological marvel. So there were over 230 kilometers of electrical wiring in the Lusitania. Her two anchors weighed 10 tons each. Beautiful interiors. She's kind of the original British luxury liner, we can say. She set the gold star and the gold standard, she and her sister ship, the Mauretania. And they were also, both ships, very, very fast. Ultimately, the Mauretania was just slightly faster at 25 knots than the Lusitania, but they both held the blue riband. This was the award for the fastest passenger liner crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The Lusitania was the first passenger liner to cross the Atlantic Ocean in under 5 days. And she was just a marvel. She became a household name around the world. And she served the public for almost 8 years. And on her last voyage, the 201st, she was torpedoed by a German U-boat, another marvel of technology. And this is where the controversy begins. Was she a legitimate target of war? Was she not? The Lusitania is a much more, I feel, complicated story than the Titanic. The Titanic is really, it's a self-encapsulated story, right? Because it happens independent of war. This ocean liner that struck an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Lusitania disaster occurred during wartime. And we still don't have all the questions as to how she sank so quickly. She sank in 18 minutes as opposed to 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was the case with the Titanic. There are still questions about how much munitions were on board the Lusitania. There were munitions. The amount declared on the manifest was 170 tons. Maybe it could have been more. Lusitania is a bit more murky, and I think that's why also some people find it perhaps a little bit more compelling.
And so, timeline-wise, Lusitania first launches 1906. The Titanic's first and only voyage was 1911, and then 1912. Sorry,
19.
And then the Lusitania sinks 1915.
Lusitania sinks May 1915.
So it's
Correct.
really running successfully backwards and forwards for almost 10 years.
Yeah, and the Lusitania came to represent kind of that long Edwardian summer. I mean, this is a ship that had three classes of service. It had elevators, it had smoking rooms, beautiful dining salons done in the style of Louis XVI, stunning staterooms. It also, like the Titanic in many ways, embodied those Edwardian virtues of class distinction, of order, of decorum. The Lusitania was a symbol of commerce, too. Of course, Lusitania and her sister ship, the Mauretania, had helped the Cunard Line capture a large share of the transatlantic passenger trade. So she represents many different things, too. But above all, I think she represents the confidence that the Edwardians had in their culture and in their empire.
And so this is officially a passenger ship between the UK and the US, but what you said before was it was carrying munitions. So during World War One, the Great War, this was also moving weaponry and all sort of artillery between the US and the UK stored aboard. Is that what you meant?
Correct. So nobody says this, and I'm not sure why, but the Lusitania was essentially a blockade runner masquerading as a passenger ship. What happens is the British declared a blockade against Imperial Germany, and the Germans countered by declaring this geographic zone around the British Isles as an area of unrestrained submarine warfare. The Germans knew that the Lusitania was carrying munitions. The Germans have spies everywhere. Also, I wanted to ask you, what percentage of the US population at this point in time do you think had ties to Germany or identified as German American?
Oof. You're probably going to get me to embarrass myself here. I have no idea. But it would be a very, very small percentage. I mean, at this point in time, people who won't be able to know what I just saw, but I just got a look from James indicating that the number is greater than what my original thought was.
No. Even Americans don't know this. It's about 30%.
Really?
So, yeah. So the German American population, in terms of its size and in terms of its importance, mirrors that of the Latino population in the United States today.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, my connection to the Germans living in the US is basically Amish people. That was about where which probably isn't that correct. But that's interesting. Why so many? What's the history of that?
Of why Germans
immigrated? What the percentage of Americans that have immigrated from Germany? 30% is such a large number.
So at that point in time, around 30% of the population identified as German or German American. This is, say, 1910 or so. Well, they immigrated to the United States for political reasons. Quite often, many were liberals who were on the wrong side in the revolutions of 1848. Germans were encouraged to settle certain areas like Wisconsin and Ohio, and they came to stake their claims through various homestead acts. And Germans were wildly successful too. Many Germans set up businesses, import and export businesses in the United States. I speak of this because this is actually my own family's background. And they later moved operations to the United States and settled in Wisconsin, in my case.
I guess when you hear about different groups of immigrants in the US, you hear about Italian Americans, Irish Americans, you hear about the huge Jewish populations. You never hear German Americans.
Well, why? Why don't we hear about German Americans?
I guess they're not in Hollywood movies as much. I'm not sure.
Well, that too, but I think it's also because of what happens in World War I and certainly what happens in World War II. So German Americans were forced to shed their hyphenated identities so as not to be identified as Nazis, but also not to be associated with perceived crimes like that of the sinking of the Lusitania.
Now, going back to the there was fewer Swiss people on the Lusitania than there were the Titanic.
Yeah,
But
there are three in
there were
particular.
three.
Yeah.
Did any of them survive?
One survived, yes. John Friedrich Diener survived. And his father was Swiss. His father was in the hospitality sector, originally working in the Roman D, even though he was Deutschschweizer, and he immigrated to Liverpool. And he later married the daughter of Irish immigrants. This was common too amongst Swiss migrants, especially to Great Britain. They married within the local population fairly quickly, oftentimes within the first generation. And John Friedrich Diener was one of his sons. And like his father, he was interested in the hospitality sector and working in hotels. And John Friedrich got the opportunity to work in the first class dining saloon on board the Lusitania. And this was actually quite a lucrative position. I know we don't think of, say, waiters or waitstaffs or stewardesses as earning that much money, but they were fairly well compensated. And this is a fairly prestigious position. You're sailing on one of the most famous ships in the world and serving in its first class dining salon. So you're rubbing up next to industry titans from the United States, from Great Britain, royalty, actors and actresses. This is not necessarily a bad gig, although the hours were quite long.
Mm.
And he had just finished his lunch shift when the Lusitania is torpedoed. And he's actually lucky. What happens when the Lusitania is torpedoed is that the ship immediately lists to starboard, to its starboard side, at a very strong angle, making it difficult for people to climb up the stairs, even to get to the boat deck. Also, the power goes out after 4 minutes. So people are shrouded in darkness. People are trapped in elevators. You hear testimonials from survivors, and they describe the screams coming from inside the ship as blood curdling and really, really just horrifying. He makes it out to the boat deck on the port side. So as I said, the Lusitania is listing heavily to starboard. What happens to the lifeboats on the starboard side? They swing outwards. So it's difficult for people to get into them. It's the opposite on the port side. They swing inwards. So it's difficult for the crew members to launch them. Also, something I should say too is because it was wartime, those most able-bodied seamen were called up to duty by the Royal Navy.
Mm.
So the caliber and quality of those seamen still on board the Lusitania, a little questionable, actually quite questionable. More often than not, the crew was unable to launch the lifeboats, and they dumped the human cargo into the Atlantic Ocean, and people were crushed. It's really just horrifying. The Titanic is kind of I've always said the Titanic is a 2-hour, 40-minute long opera in which the last 15 minutes are very depressing.
Mm-hmm.
The Lusitania is an 18-minute horror flick. It's really graphic. It's really just so horrible. And John Friedrich sees all of this. He decides, I'm not going to get in a lifeboat. And he simply goes down with the ship, like a lot of other people. And that was actually a wise decision on his part. He somehow manages to grab hold of a deck chair, and he clings to this deck chair for nearly 3 hours in 11-degree water until he's rescued.
He must be floating by himself, really, if he's in a little chair.
Well, he is surrounded by bodies, by debris. It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. You read these stories and these firsthand accounts of people who didn't know how to put on their life vests correctly. And so they put it on improperly, and then they're flipped over and they go feet first in the water. You read stories about people being attacked by seagulls. It's really horrific. And I think this is one reason too why the Lusitania has not gained the attention it deserves. It was so horrible and so violent. Whereas with the Titanic disaster, yes, the Titanic is a Edwardian morality play. You have heroes, the men put their women and children in boats. It's very orderly until the last 15 minutes when the ship breaks in half and 1,500 people are still on board. That is horrible. But yeah, there's this fine demarcation between heroics and also villainy.
What was
and that Edwardians.
What was the official response of Germany at the time? Was this a, yes, we know what we did and we did it because we know that you have munition on board? Or is this a, oh, sorry, we thought it was a different ship?
Absolutely. So the Germans blamed the British. So before the day the Lusitania sailed, there were advertisements placed in New York papers warning passengers traveling on transatlantic ocean liners that if they were to sail with vessels sailing with the flag of Great Britain or Britain's allies, so Imperial Russia and France, they were liable to destruction in British territorial waters, that this was a war zone. And this was the Imperial Germans' attempt to dissuade people from sailing on ships like the Lusitania. And so when the Lusitania sank, the German response was essentially, well, we warned you. We told you so. And they claimed that this was a ship carrying munitions, which is correct. However, the passengers on the Lusitania were very innocent. They had nothing to do with war. And that's what makes this tragedy perhaps even more harrowing and sobering, really.
And given that there is clearly someone to blame, argue who specifically is up for debate, I suppose, whether it's part German, part British, but clearly there is someone to blame. What is does Switzerland or other countries governments have official responses to this?
So the Swiss did launch a protest. They sent a protest message to Berlin, Bern did, and the Swiss papers were resoundingly negative insofar as how they saw the disaster, especially the Tribune de Genève. Many people were shocked. Many people were angered that this was a breach of civilized behavior and decorum. The Swiss also asked for compensation and restitution. I'm not sure that ever came. Nonetheless, I'm going to spin this a little bit differently. So I am American by birth. What's interesting, I think, is the fact that under neutrality laws at this particular point in time, the US, their position was, we're angry that over 120 Americans died. Nonetheless, we did not breach any of our neutrality laws. And here's why. If you're an independent American firm selling munitions or guns or armaments to the British government, that's between the British government and those respective companies. It's not the US government is outside of that equation. And that was their stance.
So that's even during wartime, that still applies.
Yes. And something else people don't know is that the sale of munitions in 1914, 1915 had created a trade surplus of $1.5 billion. And this had pulled the US out of a recession. It's crazy. So when we try to ascribe blame in this disaster, it's really difficult to assign it to one party. And I think this also is another reason why the Lusitania is so compelling and so curious.